It has become known to me that my youngest niece has been watching some of my videos when she hasn't been able to sleep at night. So I offered her the option of picking this month's Storytime with Tamsin. And she's picked one of my favourites, so that's nice. We're going to have lots of fun in the bottom of the garden today. We are reading A Bear Called Paddington by Michael Bond. This is from an anthology set that comes in a box with several of the follow-on books. But I thought I would read to you today from the very first beginning where we all meet Paddington. Paddington is one of my favourites. And the phrase, watch out for the phrase, a dog must be carried when you watch the movie, because every time we go to London now and we see those signs, we giggle quietly to ourselves. So sit back, relax and enjoy A Bear Called Paddington as you watch for fun, watch while you're having your tea, watch while you're doing something else or trying to fall asleep. So, for Jasmine. Chapter 1. Please look after this bear. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that's how he had such an unusual name for a bear, because Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were there to meet their daughter Judy, who was coming home from school for the holidays. It was a warm summer day. The station was crowded with people on their way to the seaside. Trains were humming, loudspeakers blaring, porters rushing about and shouting at one another. Altogether, there was so much noise that Mr. Brown, who saw him first, had to tell his wife several times before she understood. A bear? On Paddington Station? Mrs. Brown looked at her husband in amazement. Don't be silly, Henry, that can't be. Mr. Brown adjusted his glasses. But there he is, he insisted. I distinctly saw it over there, near the bicycle racks, wearing a funny kind of hat. Without waiting for a reply, he caught hold of his wife's arm, pushed her through the crowd, round a trolley laden with chocolate and cups of tea, past a bookstall, and through a gap in the pile of suitcases towards the lost property office. There you are, he announced triumphantly, pointing into a dark corner. I told you so. Mrs. Brown followed the direction of his arm and dimly made out a small, furry object in the shadows. It seemed to be sitting on some suitcases, and it had a label with it round its neck with some writing on it. The suitcase was old and battered, and on the side, in large letters, were the words, "Wanted on voyage." Mrs. Brown clutched at her husband. "Why, Henry," she exclaimed, "I can't believe you were right after all. It is a bear." She peered at it more closely. It seemed to be a very unusual kind of bear. It was brown in colour, rather dirty brown, and it was wearing the most odd-looking hat with a wide brim, just as Mr. Brown had said. From beneath the brim, there were two large round eyes staring back at her. Seeing that something was expected of it, the bear stood up and politely raised its hat, revealing two black ears. "Good afternoon," it said in a small, clear voice. Good afternoon," replied Mr. Brown doubtfully. There was a moment of silence. The bear looked at them inquiringly. "Can I help you?" Mr. Brown looked rather embarrassed. "Well, actually, as a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you." Mrs. Brown bent down. "You're a very small bear," she said. The bear puffed out his chest. "I'm a rare sort of bear," he replied importantly. "There aren't many of us left where I come from." "And where is that?" asked Mrs. Brown. The bear looked round carefully before replying. "Darkest Peru. I'm really not supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway." A stowaway? Mr. Brown lowered his voice and looked anxiously over his shoulder. He almost expected to see a policeman standing behind him with a notebook and pencil, taking everything down. Yes, said the bear. I emigrated, you know. A sad expression came into its eyes. I used to live with my Aunt Lucy in Peru, but she had to go into a home for retired bears. You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America by yourself, exclaimed Mrs. Brown. The bear nodded. Aunt Lucy said she wanted me to emigrate as soon as I was old enough. That's why she taught me to speak English. Well, whatever did you do for food? Asked Mr. Brown. You must be starving. Bending down, the bear unlocked the suitcase with a small key, which it also had round its neck, and brought out an almost empty glass jar. I ate marmalade, he said rather proudly. Bears like marmalade, and I lived in the lifeboat. Well, what are you going to do now? Asked Mr. Brown. You can't just sit on Paddington Station and wait for something to happen. Oh, I shall be all right, I expect. The bear bent down to do up its case again, and as he did so, Mrs. Brown caught glimpses of the writing on the label. It said simply, Please look after this bear. Thank you. She turned appealingly to her husband. Oh, Henry, what shall we do? We can't just leave him here. There's no knowing what might happen to him. London's such a big place when you've nowhere to go. And can't he come and stay with us for a few days? Mr. Brown hesitated. Mary, dear, we can't take him, not just like that. After all what? Said Mrs. Brown in a firm note. She looked down at the bear. He is rather sweet, and he'd be such company for Jonathan and Judy, even if it is only for a little while. They'd never forgive us if you left him here. It all seems highly irregular, said Mr. Brown doubtfully. I'm sure there's a law about it. He bent down. Would you like to come and stay with us? He asked. That is, he added hastily, not wishing to offend the bear, if you've nothing else planned. The bear jumped and his hat nearly fell off with excitement. Oh, yes, please. I should like that very much. I've nowhere to go, and everyone seems in such a hurry. Well, that's settled then, said Mrs. Brown, before her husband could change his mind. And you can have marmalade for breakfast every morning. And she tried to think what else bears might like. Every morning? Said the bear, who could hardly believe his ears. I only had it on special occasions at home. Marmalade is very expensive in darkest Peru. Then you shall have it every morning starting tomorrow, continued Mrs. Brown, and honey on Sundays. A worried expression came over the bear's face. Will it cost a very lot of money? He asked. You see, I haven't got much money. Of course not. We wouldn't dream of charging you anything. We shall expect you to be one of the family, shan't we, Henry? Said Mrs. Brown, looking at her husband for support. Of course, said Mr. Brown. By the way, he added, if you are coming home with us, you'd better know our names. This is Mrs. Brown, and I'm Mr. Brown. The bear raised his hat politely, twice. I haven't really got a name, he said, only a Peruvian one which no one can understand. Then we'd better give you an English one, said Mrs. Brown. It'll make things much easier. She looked around the station for inspiration. It ought to be something special, she said thoughtfully. As she spoke, an engine standing in one of the platforms gave a loud wail and the train began to move. I know what, she exclaimed. We found you on Paddington Station, so we will call you Paddington. Paddington. The bear repeated it several times just to make sure. It seems a very long name. Quite distinguished, said Mr. Brown. Yes, I like Paddington as a name. Paddington it shall be. Mrs. Brown stood up. Good. Now, Paddington, I have to meet our little daughter Judy off the train. She's coming home from school. I'm sure you must be thirsty after your long journey, so you go along to the buffet with Mr. Brown and he'll buy you a nice cup of tea. Paddington licked his lips. I'm very thirsty," he said. "Sea water makes you thirsty." He picked up his suitcase, pulled his hat down firmly over his head, and waved a paw politely in the direction of the buffet. "After you, Mr. Brown." Thank you, Paddington," said Mr. Brown. "Now, Henry, look after him," said Mrs. Brown. "And for goodness sake, when you get a moment, take that luggage label off his neck. It makes him look like a parcel. I'm sure he'll get put into the luggage van or something if a porter sees him." The buffet was crowded when they entered, but Mr. Brown managed to find a table for two in the corner. By standing on a chair, Paddington could just rest his paws comfortably on the glass top. He looked around with interest while Mr. Brown went to fetch the tea. The sight of everyone eating reminded him of how hungry he felt. There was a half-eaten bun on the table, but just as he reached out his paw, a waitress came and swept it by into the pan. "You don't want that, dearie," she said, giving him a friendly pat. "You don't know where it's been." Paddington felt so empty he didn't really mind where it had been, but he was much too polite to say anything. "Well, Paddington," said Mr. Brown, as he placed two steaming cups of tea on the table and a plate piled high with cakes, "how's that to be going on with?" Paddington's eyes glistened. "It's very nice, thank you," he exclaimed, eyeing the tea doubtfully, "but it's rather hard to drink out of a cup. It usually gets stuck on my head, or my hat falls in and makes it taste nasty." Mr. Brown hesitated. "Then you'd better give your hat to me. I'll pour the tea into a saucer for you. It's not really done in the best circles, but I'm sure nobody will mind just this once." Paddington removed his hat and laid it carefully on the table while Mr. Brown poured the tea. He looked hungrily at the cakes, in particular a large cream and jam one, which Mr. Brown had placed on a plate in front of him. "There you are, Paddington," he said. "I'm sorry they haven't got any marmalade ones, but that was the best I could get." "I'm glad I emigrated," said Paddington, as he reached out a paw and pulled the plate nearer. "Do you think anyone would mind if I stood on the table to eat?" Before Mr. Brown could answer, he had climbed up and placed his right paw firmly on the bun. It was a very large bun, the biggest and stickiest Mr. Brown had been able to find, and in a matter of moments it had found its way onto Paddington's whiskers. People started to nudge each other and began staring in their direction. Mr. Brown wished he had chosen a plain ordinary bun, but he wasn't experienced in the way of bears. He stirred his tea and looked out of the window, pretending that he had had tea every day with a bear on Paddington Station every day of his life. "Henry!" The sound of his wife's voice brought him back to earth with a start. "Henry, whatever have you done to that poor bear? Look at him! He's covered with jam and cream." Mr. Brown looked up in confusion. "He seemed rather hungry," said Mr. Brown lamely. Mrs. Brown turned to her daughter. "This is what happens when I leave your father alone for 5 minutes. Judy clapped her hands excitedly. "Oh, Daddy, is he really going to stay with us?" "If he does," said Mrs. Brown, "I can see someone other than your father will have to look after him. Just look at the mess he's in." Paddington, who all this time had been too interested in his bun to worry what was going on, suddenly became aware that people were talking about him. He looked up to see that Mrs. Brown had been joined by a little girl with laughing blue eyes and long fair hair. He jumped up, meaning to raise his hat, and in his haste slipped on a patch of strawberry jam which had somehow or other found its way onto the glass tabletop. For a brief moment he had a dizzy impression of everything and everyone being upside down. He waved his paws wildly in the air, and then, before anyone could catch him, he somersaulted backwards and landed with a splash in his saucer of tea. He jumped up even quicker than he'd sat down, because the tea was still hot, and promptly stepped into Mr. Brown's cup. Judy threw her head back and laughed until tears rolled down her face. "Oh, Mummy, isn't he funny?" she cried. Paddington, who didn't think it was at all funny, stood for a moment with one foot on the table, the other in Mr. Brown's tea. There was large patches of cream all over his face, and on his left ear there was a lump of strawberry jam. "You wouldn't think," said Mrs. Brown, "that anyone could get in such a state with just one bun." Mr. Brown coughed. He had just caught the stern eye of the waitress on the other side of the counter. "Perhaps," he said, "we'd better go. I'll see if I can find a taxi." He picked up Judy's belongings and hurried outside. Paddington stepped gingerly off the table and with one last look at the sticky remains of his bun climbed down onto the floor. Judy took one of his paws. "Come along, Paddington. We'll take you home and you can have a nice hot bath. Then you can tell me all about South America. I'm sure you must have had lots of wonderful adventures." "I have," said Paddington earnestly. "Lots. Things are always happening to me. I'm that sort of bear." When they came out of the buffet, Mr. Brown had already found a taxi and waved them across. The driver looked hard at Paddington and then at the inside of his nice, clean taxi. "Bears is extra," he said gruffly. "Sticky bears, twice as much again." "He can't help being sticky, driver," said Mr. Brown. "He's had a nasty accident." The driver hesitated. "All right, hop in. But mind none of it comes off on me interiors. Only cleaned it out this morning." The Browns trooped obediently into the back of the taxi. Mr. Brown, Mrs. Brown and Judy sat in the back, while Paddington stood on a tip-up seat behind the driver so that he could see out of the window. The sun was shining as they drove out of the station, and after the gloom and noise, everything seemed bright and cheerful. They swept past a group of people at the bus stop, and Paddington waved. Several of the people stared, and one man raised his hat in return. It was all very friendly. After weeks of sitting alone in the lifeboat, there was so much to see. There were people and cars and big red buses everywhere. It wasn't a bit like darkest Peru. Paddington kept one eye out of the window in case he missed anything, and with the other eye he carefully examined Mr. and Mrs. Brown and Judy. Mr. Brown was fat and jolly with a big moustache and glasses, while Mrs. Brown, who was also rather plump, looked like a larger edition of Judy. Paddington had just decided he was going to like staying with the Browns, when the glass window behind the driver shot back and a gruff voice said, "Where did you say you want to go?" Mr. Brown leaned forward. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens." The driver cupped his ear with one hand. "Can't hear you," he shouted. Paddington tapped him on the shoulder. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens," he repeated. The taxi driver jumped at the sound of Paddington's voice and narrowly missed hitting a bus. He looked over his shoulder and glared. "Cream," he said bitterly, "all over my new coat." Judy giggled and Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. Mr. Brown peered at the meter. He half expected to see the sign go up saying he had to pay another 50p. "I beg your pardon," said Paddington. He bent forward and tried to rub the stain off with his other paw. Several bun crumbs and a smear of jam added themselves mysteriously to the taxi driver's coat. The driver gave Paddington a long, hard look. Paddington raised his hat, and the driver slammed the window shut again. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "We really will have to give him a bath as soon as we get indoors. It's getting everywhere." Paddington looked thoughtful. It wasn't so much that he didn't like baths. He really didn't mind being covered with jam and cream. It seemed a pity to wash it off so soon. But before he had time to consider the matter, the taxi stopped and the Browns climbed out. Paddington picked up his suitcase and followed Judy up a flight of white steps to a big green door. "Now, you're going to meet Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "She looks after us. She's a bit fierce sometimes and she grumbles a lot, but she doesn't really mean it. I'm sure you'll like her." Paddington felt his knees begin to tremble. He looked around for Mr. and Mrs. Brown, but they appeared to be having some sort of argument with the taxi driver. Behind the door he could hear footsteps approaching. "I'm sure I'll like her if you say so," he said, catching sight of his reflection on the brightly polished letterbox. But will she like me? Chapter 2. A Bear in Hot Water. Paddington wasn't quite sure what to expect when Mrs. Bird opened the door. He was pleasantly surprised when they were greeted by a stout, motherly lady with grey hair and a kindly twinkle in her eyes. "Good gracious, you've arrived already," she said in horror. "And me hardly finishing the washing up. I suppose you'll be wanting tea." "Hello, Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "It's nice to see you again. How's the rheumatism?" "Worse than it's ever been," began Mrs. Bird. Then she stopped speaking and stared at Paddington. "Whatever have you got there?" she asked. "What is it?" "It's not a what," said Judy. "It's a bear. His name's Paddington." Paddington raised his hat. "A bear?" said Mrs. Bird doubtfully. "Well, he has good manners, I'll say that for him." "He's going to stay with us," announced Judy. "He's emigrated from South America, and he's all alone with nowhere to go." "Going to stay with us," said Mrs. Bird. "How long for?" Judy looked around mysteriously before replying. "I don't know," she said. "It depends on things." "Mercy me," said Mrs. Bird. "I wish you'd told me. I haven't put clean sheets in the spare room or anything." She looked down at Paddington. "Although, judging by the state he's in, perhaps that's just as well." "It's all right, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington. "I'm going to have a bath. I had an accident with a bun." "Oh," said Mrs. Bird. She held the door open. "Oh, well, in that case you'd better come in. Only mind the carpet. It's only just been done." Judy took hold of Paddington's paw and squeezed. "She doesn't mind really," she whispered. "I think she quite likes you." Paddington watched the retreating figure of Mrs. Bird. "She seems a bit fierce," he said. Mrs. Bird turned. "What did you say?" Paddington jumped. I, he began. "Where did you say you were from? Peru?" "That's right," said Paddington. "Darkest Peru." "Humph." Mrs. Bird looked thoughtful for a moment. "Then I expect you like marmalade. I'd better get some more from the grocer." "There you are! Didn't I tell you?" Judy cried as the door shut behind Mrs. Bird. "She does like you." "Fancy her knowing I like marmalade," said Paddington. "Mrs. Bird knows everything about everything," said Judy. "Now you better come upstairs with me and I'll show you to your room. It used to be mine when I was small. It has lots of pictures of bears on the wall, so I expect you'll feel at home." She led the way up a flight of stairs, chattering all the time. Paddington followed closely behind, keeping carefully to the side of the carpet, so not having to tread on it. "That's the bathroom," said Judy, "and that's my room. That's Jonathan's. He's my brother. You'll meet him soon." She opened a door. "This is going to be yours." Paddington nearly fell over with surprise when he followed her into the room. He'd never seen such a big one. There was a large bed with white sheets against one wall, several boxes, one with a mirror on it. Judy opened a drawer in one of the boxes and said, "This is a chest of drawers. You'll be able to keep your things in here." Paddington looked at the drawer and his suitcase. "I don't seem to have very much. That's the trouble with being small. No one ever expects you to want things." "Then we will have to see what we can do," said Judy mysteriously. "I'll try and get Mummy to take you on one of her shopping trips." She knelt down beside him. "Let me help you unpack." "That's very kind of you," Paddington fumbled with the lock, "but I don't think there's much you can help me with. There's a jar of marmalade, only there's hardly any left now, and what there is tastes of seaweed. And my scrapbook, and some centavos. They're a sort of South American penny." "Gosh," said Judy, "I've never seen any of those before. Aren't they bright?" "Oh, I keep them polished," said Paddington. "I don't spend them." He pulled out a tattered photograph. "And that's a picture of my Aunt Lucy. She had it taken just before she went into the home for retired bears in Lima. She looks very nice," said Judy, "and very wise." Seeing that Paddington had a sad, faraway look on his face, she added hastily, "I'm going to leave you now so that you can have your bath and come down nice and clean. You'll find 2 taps, one marked hot and one marked cold. There's plenty of soap and a clean towel. Oh, and a brush so that you can scrub your back." "Sounds very complicated," said Paddington. "Can't I just sit in a puddle or something?" Judy laughed. "Somehow I don't think Mrs. Bird would approve of that. And don't forget to wash your ears, they look awfully black." "They're meant to be black," said Paddington indignantly as Judy shut the door. He climbed onto the stool by the window and looked out. There was a large, interesting garden below with a small pond and several trees which looked good for climbing. Beyond the trees he could see more houses stretching away into the distance. He decided it must be wonderful living in a house like this all the time. He stayed where he was, thinking about it, until the window became steamed up and he couldn't see it any more. Then he tried writing his name on the cloudy part with his paws. He began to wish it wasn't quite so long, because he soon ran out of cloud, and it was a rather difficult name to spell. All the same, he climbed onto the dressing table and looked at himself in the mirror. "It's a very important name. I don't expect there are many bears in the world called Paddington." If only he had known Judy was saying exactly the same thing to Mr. Brown at the very moment. The Browns were holding a council of war in the dining room, and Mr. Brown was fighting a losing battle. It had been Judy's idea in the first place to keep Paddington. In this she not only had Jonathan on her side, but also her mother. Jonathan had not yet met Paddington, but the idea of having a bear in the family appealed to him. It sounded very important. "After all, Henry," argued Mrs. Brown, "you can't turn him out now. It wouldn't be right." Mr. Brown sighed. He knew he was beaten. It wasn't that he didn't like the idea of keeping Paddington. Secretly, he was just as keen as anyone, but as head of the Brown household, he felt he ought to consider the matter from every angle. "I'm sure we ought to report the matter to someone at first," he said. "I don't see why, Dad," cried Jonathan. "Besides, he might get arrested for being a stowaway if we do that." Mrs. Brown put down her knitting. "Jonathan's right, Henry. We can't let that happen. It's not as if he's done anything wrong. I'm sure he didn't harm anyone travelling in the lifeboat like that." "Well, then there's the question of pocket money," said Mr. Brown, weakening. "I'm not sure how much pocket money to give a bear." "He can have £1 a week, the same as the other children," said Mrs. Brown. Mr. Brown lit his pipe carefully before replying. "Well," he said, "we'll have to see what Mrs. Bird has to say about it first, of course." There was a triumphant chorus from the rest of the family. "You'd better ask her then," said Mrs. Brown, when the noise had died down. "It was your idea." Mr. Brown coughed. He was a little bit afraid of Mrs. Bird. He wasn't sure how she would take it. He was about to suggest that they left it for a little while, when the door opened and Mrs. Bird herself came in with the tea things. She paused for a moment and looked around at the sea of expectant faces. "I suppose," she said, "you want to tell me that you've decided to keep young Paddington." "May we, Mrs. Bird?" pleaded Judy. "Please, I'm sure he'll be very good." "Humph," said Mrs. Bird as she put the tray down. "That remains to be seen. Different people have different ideas about being good all the same. He does look like the sort of bear that means well." Mrs. Bird thought for a moment. No, I don't mind at all. I've always had a soft spot for bears. It'll be nice to have one round the house." "Well," gasped Mrs. Brown as the door closed, "whoever would have thought that?" "I expect it's because he raised his hat," said Judy. "It made a good impression. Mrs. Bird likes polite people." Mrs. Brown picked up her knitting. "I suppose someone ought to write and tell his Aunt Lucy. I'm sure she'd like to know he's safe." She turned to Judy. "Perhaps it would be nice if you and Jonathan wrote." "By the way," said Mr. Brown, "come to think of it, where is Paddington? He's still not up in his room, is he?" Judy looked up from the writing desk where she was searching for notepaper. "Oh, he's all right. He's just having a bath." A bath? Said Mrs. Brown, with a worried expression on her face. He's rather small to be having a bath all by himself. Don't fuss so, Mary, grumbled Mr. Brown, settling himself in his armchair with the newspaper. He's probably having the time of his life. Mr. Brown was fairly near the truth when he said Paddington was having the time of his life. Unfortunately, it wasn't in the way he meant. Blissfully unaware that his fate was being decided, Paddington was sitting in the middle of the bathroom floor, drawing a map of South America with a tube of Mr. Brown's shaving cream. Paddington liked geography. At least, he liked his sort of geography, which meant seeing strange places and new people. Before he left South America on his long journey to England, his Aunt Lucy, who was a very wise old bear, had done her best to teach him all she knew. She told him all about the places he would see on the way. She had spent many long hours reading to him about the people he would meet. It had been a long journey, halfway round the world, and Sir Paddington's map occupied most of the bathroom floor. He also used up most of Mr. Brown's shaving cream. With a little left, he tried writing his new name. He had several attempts. He finally decided on Paddington. It looked most important. It wasn't until a trickle of warm water landed on his nose that he remembered about the bath and that it was now full and beginning to run over the sides. With a sigh, he climbed up onto the side of the bath, closed his eyes, held his nose with one paw and jumped. The water was hot and soapy and much deeper than he had expected. In fact, he had to stand on his tiptoes to even keep his nose above the surface. It was then he had a nasty shock. It's one thing getting into the bath, it's quite another getting out. Especially when the water comes up to your nose, the sides are slippery and your eyes are full of soap. He couldn't even see to turn the taps off. He tried calling out, "Help!" First in a quiet voice and then very loudly, "Help! Help!" He waited for a few moments, but nobody came. Suddenly he had an idea. What a good thing he was still wearing his hat. He took it off and began bailing out the water. There were several holes in the hat because it was very old and had belonged to his uncle. But if the water didn't get much less, at least it didn't get much more. "That's funny," said Mr. Brown, jumping up from his armchair and rubbing his forehead. "I could have sworn I felt a drop of water." "Don't be silly, dear. How could you?" said Mrs. Brown, busy with the knitting, not even bothering to look up. Mr. Brown grunted and returned to his newspaper. He knew he had felt something, but there was no point in arguing. He looked suspiciously at the children, but both Judy and Jonathan were busy writing their letter. "How much does it cost to send a letter to South America?" asked Jonathan. Judy was about to reply when another drop of water fell from the ceiling, this time onto the table. "Oh, gosh!" she replied, jumping to her feet, pulling Jonathan after. An ominous wet patch right over their heads and right underneath the bathroom. "Where are you going now, dear?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Oh, just upstairs to see how Paddington's getting on." Judy pushed Jonathan through the door and shut it quickly. "Crikey," said Jonathan, "what's up?" "It's Paddington," cried Judy over her shoulder as she rushed up the stairs. "I think he's in trouble." She ran along the landing, banging loudly on the bathroom door. "Are you all right, Paddington?" she shouted. "Can we come in?" "Help! Help!" cried Paddington. "Please come in. I think I'm going to drown." "Oh, Paddington!" Judy leaned over the side of the bath and Jonathan helped lift a dripping and very frightened Paddington onto the floor. "Oh, Paddington, thank goodness you're all right." Paddington lay on his back in a pool of water. "What a good job I had my hat," he panted. "Aunt Lucy told me never to be without it." "But why on earth didn't you pull the plug out, you silly?" said Judy. "Oh," said Paddington, looking crestfallen. "I never thought of that." Jonathan looked admiringly at Paddington. "Crikey," he said. "Fancy making all this mess. Even I've never made a mess such as this." Paddington sat up and looked around. The whole of the bathroom floor was covered in a sort of white foam where the hot water had landed on his map of South America. It is a bit untidy, he admitted. I don't really know how it got like that. Untidy? Judy lifted him to his feet and wrapped him in a towel. Paddington, we've got a lot of work to do before you go downstairs. If Mrs. Bird sees this, I don't know what she'll do. I do, exclaimed Jonathan. She says it to me sometimes. Judy began wiping the floor with a cloth. Now, just you dry yourself quickly in case you catch cold. Paddington began rubbing himself meekly with a towel. I must say, he remarked, looking at himself in the mirror, I am a lot cleaner than I was. It doesn't look like me at all. Paddington did look much cleaner than when he had first arrived at the Browns. His fur, which was really quite light in colour, was not dark brown, as it had been, was now standing out like a new brush, except it was soft and silky. His nose gleamed, and his ears had lost all traces of the jam and cream. He was so much cleaner that when he arrived downstairs and entered the dining room some time later, everyone pretended not to recognise him. The tradesman's entrance is round the side, said Mr. Brown from behind his paper. Mrs. Brown put down her knitting and stared at him. I think you've come to the wrong house, she said. This is number 32, not 34. Even Judy and Jonathan agreed there must be some mistake. Paddington began to get quite worried until they all burst out laughing and said how nice he was, brushed, combed and respectable. They made room for him in a small armchair by the fire. Mrs. Bird came in with another pot of tea and a plate of hot buttered toast. Now, Paddington, said Mr. Brown, when they were all settled, suppose you tell us all about yourself and how you came to Britain. Paddington settled back in his armchair, wiped a smear of butter carefully from his whiskers, put his paws behind his head, stretched out his toes towards the fire. He liked an audience, especially when he was warm and the world seemed such a nice place. I was brought up in darkest Peru, he began, by my Aunt Lucy. She's the one that lives in the home for retired bears in Lima. He closed his eyes thoughtfully. A hush fell over the room, and everyone waited expectantly. After a while, when nothing happened, they began to get restless. Mr. Brown coughed loudly. It doesn't seem like a very exciting story, he said impatiently. He reached across and poked Paddington with his pipe. Well, I never, he said. I do believe he's fallen asleep. Chapter 3. Paddington Goes Underground. Watch out for the dog, must be carried. Paddington was very surprised when he woke up the next morning and found himself in bed. He decided it was a very nice feeling, and as he stretched himself and pulled the sheets up round his head with a paw, he reached out with his feet and found a cool spot for his toes. One advantage of being a very small bear in a large bed was that there was so much room. After a few minutes, he poked his head out cautiously and sniffed. There was a lovely smell of something coming under the door. It seemed to be getting nearer and nearer. There were footsteps, too, coming up the stairs. As they stopped by his door, there was a knock, and Mrs. Bird's voice called out, Are you awake, young Paddington? Only just, called Paddington, rubbing his eyes. The door opened. You've had a good sleep, said Mrs. Bird. She placed a tray on the bed and drew the curtains. And you're a very privileged person to have breakfast in bed on a weekday. Paddington eyed the tray hungrily. There was half a grapefruit in a bowl, a plate of bacon and eggs, and some toast, and a whole pot of marmalade, not to mention a large cup of tea. Is that all for me? He exclaimed. If you don't want it, I can soon take it away again, said Mrs. Bird. Oh, I do, said Paddington hurriedly. It's just I've never seen so much breakfast before. Well, hurry up with it, said Mrs. Bird. She turned in the doorway and looked back. Because you're going on a shopping trip this morning with Mrs. Brown and Judy, and all I can say is, thank goodness I'm not going too. She closed the door. I wonder what she means by that, said Paddington. He didn't worry about it for very long. There was far too much to do. It was the first time he had ever had breakfast in bed, and he soon found it wasn't as easy as it looked. First of all, he had trouble with the grapefruit. Every time he pressed it with his spoon, a long stream of juice shot up and hit him in the eye, which was very painful. And all the time he was worried because the eggs and bacon were getting cold. And then there was the question of the marmalade. He wanted to leave room for the marmalade. In the end, he decided it would be much nicer if he mixed everything up on one plate and then sat on the tray to eat it. "Oh, Paddington," said Judy as she entered a few minutes later and found him perched on the tray. "Whatever are you doing now? Do hurry up, we're waiting for you downstairs." Paddington looked up, an expression of bliss on his face, that part of the face that could be seen behind egg whiskers and toast crumbs. He tried to say something, but all he could manage was a muffled grumping noise which sounded like "I'm just coming," all rolled into once. "Really?" Judy took out her handkerchief and wiped his face. "You are the stickiest bear imaginable. If you don't hurry up, all the nice things will be gone. Mummy's going to buy you a complete new outfit from Barkridge's." I heard her say so. "Now comb your fur quickly and come on down." She closed the door. Paddington looked at the remains of his breakfast. Most of it was gone. There was a large piece of bacon left, which seemed a pity to waste. He put it in his suitcase in case he'd get hungry later on. He hurried into the bathroom and rubbed his face with some warm water. He combed his whiskers carefully, and a few moments later, not looking perhaps as clean as he had done the evening before, but quite smart, he arrived downstairs. "I hope you're not wearing that hat," said Mrs. Brown as she looked at him. "Oh, do let him, Mummy," cried Judy. "It's so unusual." "Unusual's right," said Mrs. Brown. "I don't know that I have ever seen anything quite like it before. It's such a funny shape." "I don't know what you'd call it." "It's a bush hat," said Paddington proudly, "and it saved my life." "Saved your life?" repeated Mrs. Brown. "Don't be silly. How could a hat save your life?" Paddington was about to tell her about the adventure in the bath when she received a nudge from Judy. "It's a long story," he said lamely. "Then you better save it for another time," said Mrs. Brown. "Now come along, both of you." Paddington picked up his suitcase and, followed by Mrs. Brown and Judy, to the front door. By the door, Mrs. Brown paused and sniffed. "That's very strange," she said. "There seems to be a smell of bacon everywhere this morning. Can you smell it, Paddington?" Paddington started, but he put the suitcase guiltily behind himself and sniffed. He had several expressions which he kept for emergencies. This was his thoughtful expression. When he stared into space, raised his chin on his paw. Then, of course, there was the innocent expression, which wasn't really an expression at all. He decided to use that one. "It's very strong," he said truthfully, for he was a truthful bear. And then he added, perhaps not quite so truthfully, "I wonder where it's coming from." "If I were you," whispered Judy as they walked along the road to the tube station, "I should be more careful in future about what I pack in my suitcase." Paddington looked down. A large piece of bacon stuck out the side of his case and was trailing along the pavement. "Shoo!" said Mrs. Brown as a grubby-looking dog came bounding down the road. Paddington waved his suitcase. "Go away, dog," he said sternly. The dog licked his lips. Paddington glanced anxiously over his shoulder and hurried on, keeping close behind Mrs. Brown and Judy. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown. "I have a funny feeling about today, as if things were going to happen. Do you ever get that feeling, Paddington?" Paddington considered for a moment. "Sometimes," he said vaguely as they entered the station. At first, Paddington was a little disappointed at the Underground. He liked the noise and bustle and the smell of warm air, which greeted him as they went inside, but he didn't think much of the ticket. He examined the piece of green cardboard which he held in his paw. "It doesn't seem much for 80p, he said. 80p. You wouldn't even get anywhere, and you wouldn't get a ticket either on the tube now. Clearly this book is written a very long time ago. You just waft your phone at it now. It doesn't seem much for 80p, he said. After all the lovely whirring and clanking noises the ticket machine had made, it did seem disappointed. He'd expected much more for his money. But Paddington, said Mrs. Brown, you only have a ticket so that you can ride the train. They won't let you otherwise. She looked and sounded rather flustered. Secretly, she was beginning to wish they had waited till later in the day, when it wasn't quite so crowded. There was also the peculiar business of the dogs. Not one, but 6 dogs of various shapes and sizes had followed them right inside the tube station. She had a funny feeling it had something to do with Paddington, but the only time she had caught his eye, it had such an innocent expression that she felt quite upset with herself for having such thoughts. I suppose, she said to Paddington, as they stepped onto the escalator, we really ought to carry you. It says you're supposed to carry dogs, but it doesn't say anything about bears. Paddington didn't answer. He was following behind in a dream. Being a very short bear, he couldn't easily see over the side. But when he did, his eyes nearly popped out with excitement. There were people everywhere. He had never seen so many. There were people rushing down one side, and there were more people rushing up the other side. Everyone seemed in such a terrible hurry. As he stepped off the escalator, he found himself carried away between a man with an umbrella and a lady with a large shopping bag. By the time he managed to push his way free, Mrs. Brown and Judy had completely disappeared. It was then that he saw the most surprising notice. He blinked at it several times to make sure, but each time he opened his eyes, it said the same thing. Follow the amber light to Paddington. Paddington decided the underground was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to him. He turned and trotted down the corridor following the amber lights until he met another crowd of people who were queuing for the up escalator. Here, the man at the top said as he examined Paddington's ticket. What's all this? You haven't been anywhere yet. I know, said Paddington unhappily. I think I made a mistake at the bottom. The man sniffed suspiciously and called to the inspector. There's a young bear here smelling of bacon. He says he made a mistake at the bottom. The inspector put his thumbs under his waistcoat. Escalators is for the benefit and convenience of passengers, he said sternly, not for the likes of young bears to play on, especially in rush hour. Yes, sir, said Paddington, raising his hat. But we don't have escalators, said the inspector helpfully. Laters, said Paddington, in darkest Peru. It's the first one I've ever been on. It's rather difficult. Darkest Peru? Said the inspector, looking most impressed. Oh, well, in that case. He lifted up the chain which divided the up and down escalators. You'd better get back down, and don't let me catch you playing tricks again. Thank you very much, said Paddington, gratefully as he ducked under the chain. It's very kind of you, I'm sure. He turned to wave goodbye, but before he could raise his hat, he found himself being whisked into the depths of the underground again. Halfway down, he was gazing with interest at the brightly coloured posters on the wall, when a man standing behind him poked him with an umbrella. There's someone calling you, he said. Paddington looked round and was just in time to see Mrs. Brown and Judy pass by on their way back up the escalator. They waved frantically at him, and Mrs. Brown called out, "Stop!" several times. Paddington turned and tried to run up the escalator, but it was going very fast, and with his short legs, it was as much as he could do to stand still. He had his head down, and he didn't notice a fat man with a briefcase who was running in the opposite direction until it was too late. There was a roar of rage from the fat man as he toppled over and grabbed several other people. Then Paddington felt himself falling. He went bump, 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 all the way down before he shot off the end and finally skidded to a stop by the wall. When he looked around, everything seemed confused. A number of people were gathered around the fat man who was sitting on the floor rubbing his head. Away in the distance he could see Mrs. Brown and Judy trying to push their way down the up escalator. It was while he was watching their efforts Then he saw another notice. It was in a brass case at the bottom of the escalator, and it said in bright red letters, "To stop the escalator in cases of emergency, push the button." It also said, in much smaller letters, "Penalty for improper use, £50." But in his hurry, Paddington didn't notice this, and in any case, it seemed very much of an emergency. He swung his suitcase through the air and hit the button as hard as he could. If there had been confusion while the escalator was moving, there was more when it stopped. Paddington watched with surprise as everyone started running about in different directions, shouting at each other. One man even began shouting "Fire!" somewhere in the distance, and a bell began to ring. He was just thinking what a lot of excitement pressing one small button could cause, when a heavy hand descended on his shoulder. "That's him!" shouted someone, pointing an accusing finger. "I saw him do it with my own eyes, large as life." "Hit it with his suitcase!" shouted another voice. "Ought not to be allowed." Whilst from the back of the crowd, somebody else suggested sending for the police. Paddington began to feel very frightened. He turned and looked up at the owner of the hand. "Oh," he said, "it's you again. I might have known." The inspector took out a notebook. "Name, please." Paddington," said Paddington. "I said, what's your name, not where you're going," repeated the inspector. "That's right," said Paddington. "That is my name." "Paddington?" said the inspector unbelievingly. "It can't be. That's the name of the station. I've never heard of a bear called Paddington before." "It's very unusual," said Paddington. "But it's Paddington Brown, and I live at 32 Windsor Gardens. I've lost Mrs. Brown and Judy." "Oh," said the inspector, wrote something in his book. "Can I see your ticket?" I had it," said Paddington, "but I don't seem to any more." The inspector began writing again. "Playing on the escalator, travelling without a ticket, stopping the escalator. They're all very serious offences, they are." He looked up. "And what have you got to say to that, young fella, my lad?" "Well, Paddington shifted uneasily and looked at his paws. "Have you tried looking inside your hat?" The inspector, not unkindly. "People often put their tickets in there." Paddington jumped with relief. "I knew I had it somewhere," he said thankfully as he handed it to the inspector. The inspector handed it back quickly. The inside of Paddington's hat was rather sticky. "I've never known anyone take so long to get anywhere," he said, looking hard at Paddington. "Do you often travel on the Underground?" "It's my first time," said Paddington. "And the last time, if I have anything to do with it," said Mrs. Brown, as she pushed her way through the crowd. "Is this your bear, madam?" he asked the inspector. "Because if it is, I have to inform you that he's in serious trouble." He began to read from his notebook. "As far as I can see, he's broken 2 important regulations, probably more. I shall have to give him into custody." "Oh dear," said Mrs. Brown, clutching at Judy for support. "Do you have to? He's only small, and it's his first time out in London. I'm sure he won't do it again." "Ignorance of the law is no excuse," said the inspector ominously. "Not in court. Persons are expected to abide by the regulations. It says so." "In court?" Mrs. Brown passed a hand nervously over her forehead. The word court always upset her. She had visions of Paddington being taken away in handcuffs and being cross-examined and all sorts of horrible things. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw and squeezed it reassuringly. Paddington looked up gratefully. He wasn't at all sure what they were talking about, but none of it seemed nice. "Did you say persons are expected to abide by the regulations?" Judy asked firmly. "That's right," began the inspector. "I have my duty to do the same as everybody else." "It doesn't say anything about bears," Judy said innocently. "Well," the inspector scratched his head. "Not in so many words." He looked down at Judy and then Paddington and then all around. The escalator had started again and crowds of sightseers had disappeared. "It's all highly irregular," he said, "but—" "Oh, thank you," said Judy. "I think you're the kindest man I ever met." "Don't you think so, Paddington?" Paddington nodded his head vigorously and the inspector blushed. I shall always travel on this underground in the future, said Paddington politely. I'm sure it's the nicest one in all London. The inspector opened his mouth and seemed to be about to say something, but then closed it again. Come along, children, said Mrs. Brown hastily. If we don't hurry up, we shall never get our shopping done. From somewhere up above came the sound of dogs barking. The inspector sighed. I can't understand it, he said. This used to be such a well-run, respectable station. Now look at it. He stared after the retreating figures of Mrs. Brown and Judy, with Paddington bringing up the rear, and rubbed his eyes. That's funny, he said, more to himself. I must be seeing things. I could have sworn that bear had some bacon sticking out of his case. He shrugged his shoulders. There were more important things to worry about. And judging by the noise coming at the top of the escalator, there was some sort of dog fight going on, and that needed investigating. Good night, everybody.